I woke up slowly, my eyelids heavy, every muscle aching as if I had slept in a coffin. At first, the dull light above me barely flickered, giving me no clue about the room I was in. It was small, suffocatingly small four walls, bare except for a metal bed frame, a thin mattress, a chair, and a tiny table. No windows, no ventilation. I blinked several times, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, expecting anyone to call my name, but there was nothing. Silence. I tried moving my legs, stretched my arms. The bed creaked in protest, echoing strangely in the emptiness. Something about the stillness pressed down on me. Then I noticed the door. It was shut, locked. I walked over and tried the handle. Nothing. I rattled it, yanked it, pressed my shoulder into it. The door didn't even wobble. My chest tightened. My heartbeat grew frantic, echoing in the confined space. Panic clawed at my throat. I looked around desperately, hoping for some sign, some clue. My eyes rested on the table, bare, a chair, bare, nothing, nothing at all. The realization hit me like a punch. I was alone. Alone in a room that seemed to breathe along with me, in a world that had suddenly disappeared. The fear was immediate, primal. My mind screamed at me to move, to escape, to scream, but I was trapped. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my back against the cold wall, trying to make sense of it. How did I get here? Who did this, and why? My thoughts scattered, darting from memory to memory faces of loved ones. Fleeting moments, mistakes, laughter, arguments, mundane tasks I had taken for granted. My stomach growled faintly, a reminder that even in moments of terror, the body remained demanding. Hunger, thirst, survival instincts kicking into hours past, or was it minutes? Time had already begun to distort. I counted obsessively, 1, 2, 3, 40, then started again. The numbers blurred together, meaningless. I tried to sleep, curling up on the thin mattress, but every creak, every shadow seemed alive. The walls were moving, breathing, closing in. Every tiny sound a drop of sweat falling. The rustle of my shirt echoed like a shout dot by the first night. I felt the first stirrings of isolation's grip. My own voice became a companion. "You will survive," I whispered into the darkness. The echo felt alien, like another presence. I realized I had to accept my reality. I was trapped, alone, and I had no idea for how long. The second day arrived, though I couldn't tell exactly when. The dim light above flickered, an unreliable marker of time. Hunger gnawed more insistently. I tried rationing my energy, moving minimally. The walls were no longer just walls, they became something more. Shapes in the corners twisted in my peripheral vision. Shadows danced like living things. I began talking to myself more, giving voice to thoughts I had kept buried. Regrets, fears, confessions, pleas. Sleep eluded me entirely. My mind began conjuring visions, shapes, silhouettes, faint movements. Was it the room, or was it me? I could no longer trust my senses. Every sound, the drip of a leak that didn't exist, a whisper of wind that couldn't enter made my pulse race. I paced the small room, feeling the limits of the space pressing against me. Looping endlessly in a confined prison. By the third day, hunger became sharp and insistent. I realized that every calorie mattered. I started observing every tiny detail. Cracks in the walls, the flicker of the light, the texture of the mattress, the grain of the floor. My mind clung to these small details like lifelines. I counted them, categorized them, tried to measure the passage of time through meaningless exercises. Numbers became unreliable. I saw patterns where there were none, faces in the cracks, whispers in the silence. By now, hallucinations had begun in earnest. Shapes moved where nothing existed. Shadows crawled along the walls. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing that wasn't mine. The isolation pressed on me, a heavy weight that threatened to crush thought itself. I began whispering to the shadows, negotiating with them, pleading for understanding, for mercy, for companionship. The room responded only with silence, or so I thought. The fourth day was the first true test of my mind. Fatigue had set in, hunger had sharpened, and the room seemed alive with intent. I could swear the walls were observing me, breathing, shifting minutely when I looked away. I spoke constantly to myself, trying to maintain sanity. Count the tiles, I said. Track the cracks. Mark the light flickers. Do not slip. I traced patterns on the floor with my fingers, measured angles, traced imaginary lines. My mind needed order, structure, because chaos was gnawing at the edges. Sleep still refused me. Each shadow seemed purposeful, each flicker deliberate. I began imagining voices' soft whispers at first, comforting, then cruel, mocking. Sometimes I thought the voices knew me intimately, recalling memories I had tried to bury, exposing fears I had never spoken aloud. The hunger became sharper, and thirst made my tongue rough. I licked the walls, tasted the dust, searched the corners. Nothing sustained me. By the fifth day, my body had begun protesting in new ways. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. Muscles ached from pacing or standing or lying in awkward positions. My skin was dry, my lips cracked. Yet worse than physical suffering was the mind's torment. Shadows moved constantly, faces appeared in the walls, the bed, the ceiling. I spoke aloud compulsively, sometimes shouting, sometimes whispering prayers I didn't believe. I began to organize the room mentally into zones, a sleeping zone, a thinking zone, a walking zone. Each movement was deliberate, methodical, ritualized to maintain control. I marked imaginary lines on the floor to pace along. I counted each step. I spoke to imaginary companions, inventing friends, enemies, observers. It kept my mind tethered to reality or something resembling reality. The whispers grew more distinct, sometimes mimicking words I had spoken, sometimes teasing with foreign syllables. I would freeze, listening, straining to decipher meaning. Often there was none, but the effect was terrifying. The room was no longer inert. It was alive. It was aware. I was no longer its observer. I was its participant. By the end of the fifth day, exhaustion and hunger had combined into a new sensation, a slow, creeping detachment from reality. Yet I clung to one anchor, survival. I told myself repeatedly, you will endure. You will survive. No matter how long it takes. You will endure. And though fear, hallucination, and isolation gnawed at the edges of my sanity, that phrase became a mantra, a lifeline in a world that had become unrecognizable in just 5 short days. Day 6 began like a nightmare that refused to end. I woke to the same dim, flickering light, the same 4 walls pressing inward. My body was stiff, every joint screaming in protest, yet the mind, though exhausted, was still painfully alert. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing with a cruel insistence that no amount of mental fortitude could silence. Thirst burned like fire on my tongue, yet I knew there was nothing I could drink. Water did not exist here. Food did not exist. Only the endless room, the relentless silence. And me. I sat on the bed, running my hands along the cold metal frame, counting the rivets, the scratches, trying to draw a semblance of control from the chaos surrounding me. My mind was starting to fracture. Shadows that had once been mere peripheral flickers now became full figures in my vision. I could swear I saw someone or something lurking in the corners. Was it real? No, I reminded myself. There was nothing here but me. Yet even in denial, fear nestled deeper, sharper, making the small room feel larger and more menacing than the outside world ever had by mid-morning. I began the ritual of pacing the room again. Every step had meaning. Every turn, every measured stride was a battle against the creeping madness. I invented rules, 5 steps clockwise, 5 steps counterclockwise. I counted the cracks in the wall, the number of flickers of the light overhead, marking time through imaginary tallies that made sense only to me. My voice became a companion. I spoke aloud, sometimes narrating my thoughts, sometimes arguing with them. The whispers I had heard the previous days returned, clearer now, sharper. I told myself firmly, "You are in control. Do not lose control." But the mind, hungry, tired, and cornered, is not always obedient. On day 7, the isolation began to wear at the edges of reason itself. Hallucinations were now frequent and possible to ignore. I saw shapes moving along the walls, shadows twisting into grotesque forms. Faces appeared where no faces should exist. The metal frame of the bed became a skull. The cracks in the walls formed eyes that followed my every movement. I spoke to them. I begged them to leave me alone. Sometimes I laughed at their absurdity, and other times I screamed in terror. The hunger had sharpened my senses strangely. I could smell the dust in the corners, the faint metallic tang of the air, each scent exaggerated, overwhelming. My tongue felt rough, my lips cracked. I licked the corners of the walls, tasted the floors, anything to simulate nourishment, but it offered nothing. My body was rebelling, but the mind rebelled even more. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light became a story, a threat, a companion, or a tormentor. Sleep was a distant memory. I found myself alternating between pacing and sitting, talking aloud, whispering, pleading. I invented dialogues with imaginary figures, a friend to confide in, an enemy to challenge, a silent observer to judge me. Anything to maintain the illusion that I was not entirely alone. Yet in the depths of my mind, I knew the truth. I was alone. Alone in the small, suffocating space that had become both my world and my prison. Day 8 brought a different kind of terror. My body was weaker now, my stomach a constant painful reminder of my desperation. But the mind hungry for engagement became inventive. I began writing imaginary notes, long letters I would never send, chronicling my thoughts, my fears, my hallucinations. I invented routines, pacing, counting, observing, speaking. Each routine was a lifeline, each pattern a thread connecting me to sanity. The shadows became more daring. They seemed to linger longer, move quicker, take forms that were impossible yet vivid. I whispered to them, begged them, challenged them. Sometimes they responded not with words, but with sensations. A cold brush of air, the faintest vibration under my feet, a whisper in the silence. I could not trust my senses anymore, yet I clung desperately to them, because they were all I had left. I imagined a window, a door, a crack that led to freedom. Each hallucination became a puzzle, a game, a test. I would push myself to decipher them, to understand the room, to survive mentally, if not physically. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, all real, but my mind was a battlefield. And I had learned to fight without armor, without weapons, without hope beyond the next breath. Day 9 was a study in patience, endurance, and fear. The whispers, the shadows, the imagined companions, they were now constant, omnipresent. I had learned to talk over them, to speak faster, louder, insisting on my presence in the room. I invented rituals, drawing imaginary circles, pacing exact distances, chanting mantras I created from fragments of memory and desperation. Every flicker of the light became a heartbeat. Every sound a creak, a drop of dust became a signal. I counted, recorded, cataloged obsessively. I reminded myself, you will endure. You will survive. You will not break. Yet breaking seemed inevitable at times. I could feel my grip on reality loosening, my mind bending under pressure, the room expanding and contracting. alive with intention, watching, breathing. I tried sleep again, curling into the thin mattress, pulling knees to chest. But shadows loomed, shapes moved, and whispers crept into my ears. I told myself stories to distract, tales of places I had been, of people I had loved, of things I had lost. I narrated these stories aloud, hoping the sound of my voice anchored me to existence. Day 10 was, in some ways, the first day I truly understood the depth of my prison. Hunger, thirst, hallucination, exhaustion all fused into a singular sensation of relentless awareness. I was alive, painfully, uncomfortably, acutely aware of every nerve, every muscle, every breath. The room was no longer just a prison. It was a mirror, reflecting not my body, but my mind. The fear, the imagination, the despair I was confronted with myself. Unflinching, unyielding, I developed a new strategy. If I could not escape, I would endure. I would occupy the mind, feed it stories, dialogues, rituals. I would map the room endlessly, pace, speak, argue, imagine, hallucinate, write invisible letters, create invisible companions. Anything to maintain the fragile thread of sanity. By nightfall, I was exhausted but strangely alert. The room had become predictable in its unpredictability. I could anticipate shadows, interpret whispers, measure the flickers of light. I had learned to exist in a world without windows, without food, without water, without human contact. I had learned to endure, and that endurance, that adaptation became my anchor. I whispered to myself in the dark, "You have survived 10 days. 10 days and counting. You will survive more." And though the room remained silent, unyielding, and alive in its own terrifying way, I felt a small victory, the first tangible proof that I could endure. Day 11 began with a chilling realization. The room had become more than a prison, it had become a living entity. Each flicker of the dim light, each subtle creak in the floor, each shadow shifting along the walls was now a presence I could feel. I could no longer ignore the way the air seemed heavier at times, pressing against my skin like fingers. Hunger and thirst were constant, gnawing at my body, yet my mind had found an unsettling clarity. Survival required observation, ritual, and discipline. I began meticulously mapping the room in my mind, noting every crack in the walls, every dent, every irregularity in the floorboards. Each detail became a landmark in a vast, invisible landscape, allowing me to pace systematically without losing track. I spoke aloud, narrating my actions as if someone or something were listening. The sound of my own voice became a tether to reality, a lifeline in the stretching darkness. By mid-morning, the shadows had grown more distinct, almost animate. Shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, forms that were sometimes human, sometimes entirely alien. I would speak to them, bargain with them, sometimes scolding them for their intrusion, sometimes pleading for companionship. My voice echoed off the walls, rebounding with an uncanny resonance that seemed to mock me. I discovered a strange rhythm in the room's silence. Each hum, each whisper of air, each tiny vibration in the floor created patterns, which my mind eagerly deciphered. I counted them, categorized them, and began to see imaginary signals codes that told me when to move, when to speak, when to remain still. Whether real or imagined, these signals gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. Day 12 brought new tortures. Hunger had sharpened my perception. Every tiny odor, every micro movement, every shift in the flickering light was amplified to grotesque proportions. I could smell the dust in the corners, the faint metallic scent of the bed frame, the subtle decay of paint. I licked surfaces, pressed my lips against the walls, desperate for some tactile confirmation that I was alive, that the world outside the room still existed somewhere. Sleep was impossible. My body craved rest, but my mind refused. I spoke incessantly, reciting memories, inventing imaginary conversations, and giving voice to the shadows that haunted the corners. I would pace for hours, sometimes breaking into small, hurried runs within the confines of the room, my footfalls echoing like drum beats in the darkness. The hallucinations grew more vivid. Faces emerged in the cracks of walls. The flicker of light revealed figures that disappeared the instant I focused on them. Whispers became clearer, almost intelligible. Sometimes I swore they were repeating my thoughts back to me, mocking or advising, comforting or threatening. The line between imagination and reality blurred completely, yet I clung to a single rule: observe, narrate, endure. Day 13 was marked by exhaustion that transcended the body. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue had combined into a strange, dreamlike state where consciousness fluctuated like a fragile candle in the wind. I spoke aloud constantly, chanting words I didn't fully understand, narrating actions that seemed mundane but anchored me in reality. I mapped the room obsessively, pacing along invisible paths, tracing imaginary grids on the floor, mentally cataloging every detail. The shadows now interacted with me, or so I believed. They seemed to anticipate my movements, stretching or retreating as I approached. I would speak to them, sometimes issuing commands, sometimes begging, sometimes bargaining. The air seemed charged with tension, vibrating with anticipation. I clung to the belief that control, even imaginary, was necessary for survival. Food and water were long forgotten luxuries, replaced by the endless need to occupy my mind, to create order and chaos. I invented companions, one a friend, one a critic, one a silent observer. They argued, advised, mocked, comforted. I answered, countered, obeyed, questioned. The room became a stage, my mind the playwright, my body the actor. Day 14 was a study in monotony, repetition, and escalating fear. Shadows moved with purpose, whispers taunted, light flickered in irregular rhythms. I devised elaborate rituals, pacing exact numbers of steps, speaking in structured sequences, counting invisible markers. Each ritual was a safeguard against madness, a testament to my stubborn will to survive. My hallucinations intensified. The walls breathed, expanded, contracted. The bed shifted slightly when I looked away. Shadows lingered longer, forming grotesque faces, contorted expressions that vanished the moment I blinked. I whispered incessantly, creating elaborate dialogues to maintain sanity. I argued with imaginary companions, pleaded with shadows, promised myself endurance. Hunger and thirst now felt like companions rather than discomforts. My body was weak, my muscles burned with the strain of pacing and tension. But the mind, ever desperate for engagement, adapted. I began to invent games, puzzles, stories, and challenges. Each day, each hour, each minute became a task to survive mentally as well as physically. Day 15 was a pivotal point. I had endured more than 2 weeks in this confined space. The mind had fully adapted to isolation, creating layers of perception, ritual, and imagination to sustain itself. The shadows and whispers were now integrated into my consciousness. They were as real to me as the walls, the bed, the light. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, all physical realities were mitigated by the mental fortress I had built. Began to reflect on the passage of time. Days had blurred into each other. Memories of the outside world were both vivid and distant, like watching a film of someone else's life. I recited memories aloud, narrating experiences I feared I might forget. I mapped every imagined corner of the room, creating a mental landscape more detailed than the physical one. Realized that survival was no longer about escaping, it was about enduring, observing, and maintaining a thread of sanity. Each ritual, each narration, each hallucination was a tool, a weapon against the relentless pressure of isolation. And though my body ached, though hunger gnawed incessantly, and though shadows danced with uncanny intent, I felt a quiet triumph. I had survived 15 days. Halfway through the first third of this ordeal, I had endured. I whispered into the darkness, almost as a promise. You will endure. You will survive. No matter what comes next, you will endure. The room remained silent, unyielding, alive, but I had learned something vital. The mind can create its own light, even in the blackest confinement. Day 16 began with an uncanny stillness. The room felt heavier than before, every inch of air thick with a presence I could not see but could feel. My body ached, every joint stiff, every muscle protesting with a dull, persistent pain. Hunger and thirst had become constant companions, reminders that survival was as much physical as it was mental. But the mind, sharp despite exhaustion, had adapted. It created routines, rituals, and imaginary companions to sustain itself. I paced methodically, counting steps, tracing invisible paths across the floor. Each flicker of light above seemed like a heartbeat, each creak in the floorboards a signal. Shadows had become familiar adversaries, shapes shifting, stretching, retreating, appearing at the edges of vision. I spoke to them, negotiated, scolded, begged. My voice bounced off the walls, echoing like a chorus of 1,000 invisible presences dot by mid-morning. I began documenting events mentally, narrating aloud what had occurred, what I observed, what I imagined. My own voice became a tether, anchoring me in a reality that was otherwise dissolving. I cataloged hallucinations, assigning names, roles, and personalities to the shadows and whispers. It was no longer survival in the physical sense. It was a battle for mental dominion, a test of endurance against the mind's own tendencies toward chaos. Day 17 was marked by increasing desperation. Hunger had sharpened my senses in unnatural ways. I could smell the dust, the faint metallic scent of the bed frame, the subtle decay of paint. Each sensory detail was amplified. The mind, craving engagement, created games, riddles, and dialogues. Shadows conversed with me, sometimes mimicking my own words, sometimes introducing unfamiliar syllables that I interpreted as cryptic messages. Sleep was a distant memory. My body longed for rest, but the mind would not allow it. I walked, paced, narrated, argued, laughed, and screamed into the empty room. Every action had purpose, however fragile it seemed. I invented routines to maintain sanity, counting tiles, measuring cracks, observing the flicker of the light, speaking to imaginary companions, cataloging hallucinations. Each ritual was a lifeline dot by evening. I had developed a deep familiarity with the room's every imperfection, every shadow, every nuance of light. The walls were no longer barriers, they were participants, co-conspirators, adversaries. The room had a rhythm, a pulse that I had learned to anticipate and respect. My mind, though fatigued, was fully engaged, surviving by sheer force of imagination and will. Day 18 brought a new intensity. Hallucinations became elaborate, almost lifelike. Shadows stretched into forms that resembled human figures, sometimes comforting, sometimes menacing. Whispers carried intention, teasing, mocking, advising. I would respond aloud, arguing, negotiating, reasoning. The mind created scenarios to fill the void, complex narratives that intertwined with the real observations of the room, the flicker of the light, the creak of the bed frame, the draft of air. Hunger and thirst continued their relentless presence. My body was weakening, muscles trembling, limbs aching, but the mind was adaptive, transforming deprivation into hyper-awareness. I could detect the subtlest shifts in the room, interpret shadows and sounds as signals. I created elaborate rituals to maintain control, pacing exact distances, speaking sequences of numbers and letters, cataloging imaginary companions and assigning them roles. Sleep remained impossible. My eyelids would close for moments, but the mind conjured visions so vivid that I would awaken with a start, heart racing. Faces in the walls, figures in the corners, whispers at the edges of hearing, everything intensified. Yet amidst the chaos, I found focus. Endurance required mental engagement as much as physical survival. Day 19 was an exercise in endurance. I had endured over 2.5 weeks. The mind had created a fragile equilibrium, a delicate balance of hallucinations, routines, narratives, and observation. Shadows and whispers had become integral, familiar yet unpredictable. I spoke to them constantly, negotiating, commanding, questioning. Each interaction sharpened my awareness, maintained my mental faculties, and anchored me to reality, however distorted. Hunger gnawed at me relentlessly. I licked walls, tested corners, imagined finding nourishment. My body was weak, yet my mind was resourceful. I created mental challenges to distract from pain and hunger, mapping the room repeatedly, narrating memories aloud, inventing imaginary visitors, assigning personalities to the shadows. These exercises were survival tools, keeping my consciousness active and my fear manageable. By evening, I realized a strange sense of mastery. The room no longer intimidated me as it had in the early days. I anticipated shadows, interpreted whispers, predicted flickers of light. I have learned to exist entirely within this microcosm of space and time. Survival was no longer a hope, it was a routine, a structure, a methodical engagement with reality and imagination. Day 20 was a milestone. I had endured 20 days in confinement. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, hallucination, all were constants, yet I had learned to manage them. The mind, desperate for stability, had created an intricate web of rituals, narratives, and interactions. Shadows and whispers were now collaborators. Participants in the daily practice of endurance. I recited memories aloud, narrated imagined conversations, invented scenarios, cataloged hallucinations, and measured every inch of the room with obsessive precision. Each ritual reinforced control. Each observation maintained sanity. The room, alive in its own terrifying way, had become predictable. I could anticipate patterns, recognize rhythms, and respond appropriately. I realized that survival was no longer about food or water. It was about the mind. My body ached, yet I endured. My senses were heightened, my awareness acute. I had transformed fear, isolation, and hunger into tools of mental fortitude. I whispered into the darkness, 20 days. You have survived 20 days. You will survive more. You will endure. The room remained silent, unyielding, alive, but I had discovered something vital. The mind can illuminate the darkness, even when the body is weak and the world seems absent. Day 21 began with a strange clarity, a razor-sharp awareness that cut through the haze of hunger, fatigue, and isolation. The room, now deeply familiar, felt both oppressive and strangely predictable. I could anticipate every flicker of the dim light, every creak of the floorboards, every subtle shift in shadows. The small, confined space had become a universe of its own, alive in a way that was both terrifying and hypnotic. I sat on the thin mattress for hours, listening to the silence, cataloging every sound, every imperfection in the walls, the floor, and the bed frame. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, and yet my mind had adapted. I spoke aloud constantly, narrating my actions, recounting memories, and creating imaginary companions. The shadows in the corners of the room had become familiar actors, participating in dialogues I initiated. Sometimes they mocked me, sometimes they advised, sometimes they simply observed. By mid-morning, I had developed a rigid routine. I would pace, speak, count, map, and narrate. Every action was deliberate, every movement a strategy to maintain mental stability. The mind, deprived of novelty and stimulation, craved engagement, and I fed it with rituals and stories, hallucinations and invented companions. Survival was no longer merely physical, it was an exercise in mental endurance, a test of focus, imagination, and will. Day 22 brought a new intensity. The hallucinations, once sporadic, had become elaborate and immersive. Shadows stretched into recognizable forms, a friend from childhood, a stranger, a figure whose face I could not identify, but whose presence was unmistakable. Whispers filled the room with intention, speaking in syllables and tones that conveyed meaning even when words were unintelligible. I responded aloud, bargaining, arguing, pleading, sometimes laughing at the absurdity. Hunger and thirst were ever present, gnawing at my body, yet my mind found ways to distract and sustain itself. I created elaborate stories involving my imaginary companions, giving them motives, histories, personalities. I assigned tasks to the shadows, invented dialogues, narrated events. Each interaction reinforced a fragile sense of control, a delicate balance between reality and imagination. Sleep was impossible. Moments of drowsiness were invaded by visions, faces in the walls, figures in the corners, shadows that moved and whispered. My body craved rest, yet the mind demanded vigilance. I adapted by pacing, narrating, and creating increasingly complex mental exercises, each designed to keep the mind alert and engaged. Day 23 was marked by a heightened sense of observation. The room, though unchanged, had become a living puzzle. Every flicker of light, every creak, every shadow held significance. I cataloged them obsessively, noting patterns, rhythms, and anomalies. My routines had become elaborate, pacing exact distances, counting tiles and cracks, speaking sequences of numbers, reciting memories aloud, interacting with imaginary companions. The hallucinations were now fully integrated into my perception. Shadows moved with intent, whispers carried messages, and the flicker of light became a metronome for my mental exercises. I spoke constantly, narrating actions, memories, and imagined conversations. Hunger and fatigue were persistent, yet the mind, sharpened by deprivation, became hyper-aware, alert to every detail. By evening, I realized a strange mastery. The room, once terrifying, was now predictable. Shadows, whispers, and flickers of light had a rhythm I could anticipate. I had learned to exist within this microcosm of space and time, using rituals and observation to maintain control. Survival was no longer about physical needs. It was about mental dominance over isolation and fear. Day 24 brought exhaustion of a new kind. The body was weak, muscles trembling, joints stiff. Hunger and thirst gnawed relentlessly, yet the mind remained active, adaptive, inventive. I created increasingly complex narratives involving imaginary companions, shadows, and whispers. Each story, each dialogue, each ritual reinforced sanity, providing structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. Sleep remained impossible. Every attempt was invaded by hallucinations and shadows. Faces emerged from cracks, figures appeared in corners, whispers threaded through silence. Yet I had learned to manage the mind's responses. I would narrate, pace, speak, argue, and imagine, maintaining a fragile equilibrium. The room had become both adversary and ally, its every nuance understood, anticipated, and navigated. By the end of the day, I felt a quiet triumph. I had survived 24 days. The mind, though battered, was resilient. I had transformed fear, isolation, and deprivation into tools of endurance, observation, and imagination. Shadows and whispers, once terrifying, were now collaborators in my survival. Day 25 was a milestone. I had endured 25 days in confinement. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, and hallucination, all constants, were managed through rituals, narration, and mental engagement. I recited memories aloud, narrated invented stories, cataloged shadows, and assigned roles to imaginary companions. Each act reinforced control and maintained sanity. I realized that survival was no longer about escaping the room. It was about enduring, observing, and adapting. The room, alive in its own terrifying way, had become a familiar universe, its every imperfection. Shadow and flicker mapped, anticipated, and integrated into my daily rituals. I whispered to the darkness, 25 days. You have endured 25 days. You will survive 5 more. You will endure. The room remained silent, unyielding, alive. Yet I had discovered a profound truth. The mind can illuminate even the blackest confinement, creating light, structure, and meaning where none exists. Day 26 began with a strange sense of inevitability. I had survived nearly a month in this confined space, yet the room had not loosened its grip. Each flicker of light, each subtle creak, each shifting shadow felt alive, purposeful, watching. Hunger and thirst gnawed relentlessly at my body, but my mind honed, stretched, and battered by isolation remained alert. Survival was no longer about food or water. It was a test of endurance, of focus, of sheer mental will. I paced meticulously, counting steps, tracing invisible lines on the floor, speaking aloud to narrate my actions. Shadows had become companions, witnesses, adversaries, their shapes and movements predictable yet endlessly complex. Whispers filled the room, unintelligible yet charged with meaning. I answered them, argued with them, begged them, and laughed at them. Each interaction was a lifeline, a thread tethering me to the tenuous grasp of reality. By mid-morning, I had developed an elaborate system. Every corner, every wall crack, every flicker of light had significance. I cataloged them obsessively, tracing patterns, predicting movement, assigning roles to shadows and whispers. My mind had become a universe, rich with narrative, ritual, and invention, each element a tool to combat the relentless isolation pressing from all sides. Day 27 was marked by profound physical weakness. My muscles trembled, my joints screamed in protest, and every step required effort. Hunger and thirst clawed at me, yet the mind had become adaptive, turning deprivation into heightened awareness. I could detect subtle shifts in the room, a flicker, a whisper, a vibration. Each sensation became a signal, a code, a means to maintain control. Hallucinations were vivid, almost immersive. Shadows coalesced into figures, whispers formed complex messages. I conversed with them, creating elaborate dialogues, scenarios, and narratives. My voice echoed in the room, bouncing off walls, forming layers of sound that reinforced the fragile structure of my sanity. I narrated every action, recounted every memory, invented companions, assigned motives, and created challenges to occupy the mind and stave off despair. Sleep was fleeting and invaded by visions, faces, shadows, movements that disappeared when I tried to focus. Yet I endured, pacing, speaking, narrating, imagining, maintaining rituals that sustained my mental equilibrium. Day 28 was a lesson in adaptation. The room, though unchanged, had become a living ecosystem in my perception. Shadows moved with purpose, whispers carried intent, flickers of light formed rhythms. I had learned to anticipate, interpret, and respond. My routines had evolved into intricate sequences of pacing, counting, narrating, and imagining. Each ritual reinforced control, provided structure, and maintained sanity. Hunger and thirst persisted, gnawing and burning, yet my mind had transformed deprivation into clarity. I observed the room's every detail, tracked shadows, decoded whispers, and invented complex narratives involving imaginary companions. The hallucinations were no longer frightening. They were collaborators, integral to survival. I spoke aloud constantly, creating a dialogue between reality and imagination, weaving a web of structure that kept madness at bay. By evening, I felt a quiet mastery. The room's rhythm was mine. Shadows, whispers, flickers of light, all predictable, all integrated into daily routines. Survival had become ritual, endurance a practiced art, and the mind a fortress against isolation and fear. Day 29 brought both fear and reflection. Nearly a month had passed, and yet the confinement remained relentless. My body was frail, weak from lack of sustenance, yet my mind was a finely tuned instrument, responsive to every stimulus. Shadows and whispers had become familiar entities, their presence both comforting and unnerving. I conversed with them constantly, narrating actions, memories, and imagined stories. The hallucinations were vivid, faces in the cracks, figures in corners, shadows that moved with intent. I had learned to negotiate, argue, and cooperate with them, integrating them into my rituals. Pacing, counting, narrating, and imagining had become second nature. Each act was a survival strategy, reinforcing mental fortitude and maintaining control over a reality that had become fluid and unpredictable. Hunger and thirst remained constant, annoying reminders of the body's vulnerability. Yet the mind, resilient and adaptive, found clarity, focus, and purpose. I had learned that survival depended less on physical needs and more on mental engagement, on creating structure, narrative, and ritual in a world stripped of everything else. Day 30, the final day, was a culmination of endurance, adaptation, and survival. I had spent a full month in confinement, navigating hunger, thirst, hallucinations, fatigue, and relentless isolation. The room, alive in its own way, had become a universe I knew intimately. Shadows, whispers, flickers of light, they were companions, participants, adversaries, and witnesses. I began the day with reflection. I recounted memories aloud, narrated experiences, invented stories, and conversed with hallucinations and imaginary companions. Each act reinforced sanity, structure, and control. Pacing, counting, mapping, narrating, and imagining had become rituals essential to mental survival. The body ached, yet the mind was resilient. Adaptive, alive. By mid-morning, I realized a profound truth. Survival was not about escaping the room. It was about enduring, observing, adapting, and mastering the self. The room had tested every aspect of my being: fear, imagination, resilience, focus. I had emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but alive in mind and spirit. As night fell, I whispered into the darkness, 30 days. You have endured. You have survived. You will endure beyond this room. You are stronger than this confinement, stronger than fear, stronger than hunger and thirst. You have mastered the mind where the body failed. The room remained silent, unyielding, alive. Shadows lingered, whispers floated, light flickered. Yet I had discovered something undeniable. The mind can illuminate the darkest confinement, create structure where none exists, and forge endurance in the face of relentless adversity. I lay down for the first time in 30 days with a strange peace. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue were still present, but I had learned their limits. Shadows, whispers, and flickers of light were no longer threats. They were markers of endurance, symbols of mental resilience. And in that moment, I understood that survival is not merely living, it is enduring, mastering, and creating meaning where none seems possible. Day 31 began like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in a month, I stepped out of the room. Light burned my eyes. Air filled my lungs in ways I hadn't remembered, fresh, cold, sharp. And yet something felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The world beyond the door looked normal, but it carried a subtle distortion I couldn't yet name. I tried to shake off the lingering tension in my limbs, the ache from pacing endlessly in the room. My muscles protested, every joint stiff, every tendon screaming from disuse. Hunger and thirst still gnawed at me, but the strangest sensation was the persistent awareness in my mind, the same hyper-alert focus I had developed inside the room. It refused to let me relax. I walked slowly, measuring every step, observing every detail. The street outside the building was empty. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across cracked pavement. Buildings seemed slightly off, doors too high, windows misaligned, colors that didn't match reality. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nothing changed. The city was distorted, yet static. I realized immediately that this wasn't just hallucination, it was a test. Or a continuation of the confinement. In a world that felt like a dream and a trap at once, whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, brushing at the edges of my hearing. I couldn't tell if they were echoes of the room or something new, some outside force testing me, probing me. My first instinct was to speak aloud, narrate my movements, remind myself I was still here, still real. I passed a lamppost and noticed the shadow it cast didn't match the form above. It stretched like liquid, a figure I couldn't identify. I froze, my heart pounded. I tried to rationalize it, fatigue, hunger, trauma, but the shadow moved independently. It followed me silently. My instincts sharpened. I had survived the room. Now the survival was outside, in a world that obeyed no rules I knew. I kept moving. Every street corner, every building, every flicker of light was cataloged. I spoke aloud, step by step, watch, count, endure. My voice echoed strangely, carrying through the silence. A window reflected my face. I barely recognized my self-sunken eyes, taut skin, an expression sharpened by fear and awareness. The man staring back wasn't just exhausted. He was alert in a way that terrified me. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time felt distorted, stretched, compressed. Shadows moved slightly differently with each blink. Whispers became words, then sentences that I half understood. They offered guidance, threats, fragments of memory. I couldn't ignore them. I couldn't trust them. My survival strategy from the room, observation, narration, ritual, was now essential outside. I came to a crossroads. Two streets, both leading deeper into the city. One felt wrong, unnatural. One felt safer, or as safe as a distorted city could be. I paused, measuring, observing, listening to the whispers and the flickers in the corner of my eye. Step by step, I chose one path, narrating my choice aloud. I move forward. I endure. The day dragged into night. Streetlights flickered, shadows danced, whispers persisted. I realized something vital. The room had taught me endurance, focus, and observation, but this world demanded adaptation. Every instinct, every ritual, every strategy honed in confinement was now a tool to navigate a reality that defied roll stop by the end of the first day outside. I understood a terrifying truth. Survival didn't end with the room. It had only begun. The world beyond was another maze, twisted, silent, alive. And the shadows, the whispers, the flickers, they were waiting, watching, testing me. I whispered to myself as I found a corner to rest. I survived 30 days. I survived the room, but this is something new, and I will endure.